Howdy folks, I'm Hank Sheffer and I'm here with Larry Hedrick this morning. One of the things that intrigues me as much as anything about mysteries of the Superstition Mountains are the questions and the comments that we receive from all over the country. During the past 5 years, we have received responses from so many states here at home, and we received comments from people in countries as far off as Peru, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Canada, just to mention a few. Of course, people from everywhere still continue to show interest in the stories about Jacob Waltz and his lost Dutchman mine, as well as the rich history of the Superstition Mountain area, right here in Arizona. But this time, we're going to devote the entire episode of Mysteries to talking about and hopefully answering some of the many questions that show up in our comment section. One of the most recent and popular shows has been the one about the 24 lost Dragoon pistols. So the first question is, Larry, you've received a lot of inquiries about this show, haven't you?
Yep.
There seemed to be some confusion with the series about these guns until we condensed all three of the previous videos into one.
Well, yeah, that's where the confusion came in. We didn't plan it this way, but this 24 Dragoon Pistol story was done in 3 parts. And the second and third part was a year separate from the first part. And when we got to looking at the numbers, all 3 of those parts together run about 30,000 views. And the problem was a lot more people saw this part 2 than saw part 1, which was a year earlier. And there's where all the meat of the story was. So there's why the confusion that came in. So we've decided that we would combine 3 or 4 stories that we've done that was in parts. And we didn't plan those to be in parts either. And far less questions have come about when we've done that. So that's why we're kind of repeating some of these stories that we told, because we're combining them all into one part. And it's been successful. We're looking right now, as you mentioned, views from all over the world. We're looking at almost 5 million views now from everywhere. And that's 1 million views a year. And we're pretty happy about that.
So one of the questions that keeps popping up is, what was so all-fired important about these doggone Dragoons? Why were they Dragoons to start with? Why did they have to be Dragoons?
Well, I don't suppose they had to be, but, during the Mexican War, there were 1,100 Dragoons made and issued during that war. And this was a war of almost 100% muzzle-loading, single-shot pistols and rifles. And here the Dragoon was a 6-shot, which, like in the Texas Rangers, some of them had 2 Dragoons, and this gave them 12 shots. This equaled 10 men, and they were devastating. And the Dragoon pistol, as you can see by this picture here, we have a Dragoon on the top and an Army revolver on the bottom. And look at the difference in the length of the cylinder. The 1860 Army only held about 25 or 30 grains of powder. The Dragoon held 60 grains of powder. Now that didn't mean it shot twice as far, but the effective range on that was at least another 30 yards beyond the standard model that was being issued out here in Arizona too. And during the Indian Wars in Arizona was completely different than anywhere else. This was all done in mountainous country, and no decent, self-respecting Indian ever got close enough to a cavalryman to use a saber. So they abandoned the use of the saber. So a pistol that was equivalent to the .357 Magnum in power, it was the most powerful gun ever made up till the .357 Magnum, was essential for a longer distance shot.
That's really interesting. One of the fellows wrote in jokingly, I hope. He said, Larry showed us a Dragoon pistol sometime back in one of his videos. My question is, what did he do with the other 23? And considering that the one sold for $1.6 million, that would make the other 23 worth almost $37 million. You're not holding that on me, are you?
That's just another mystery of the Superstition Mountains.
See how you are. Okay, well, getting back to the serious side. One listener wrote in, he said, just in case, are you sure there wasn't a trail or a drover's path where the road is today?
Well, this was 1871 or 1872, as I originally told it in the story. But I was able to narrow that down by reading the book, The Last Bugle Call, which is a history of Fort McDowell. And a year-to-year, month-by-month, blow-by-blow description was told in that book. And on page 66, I run across an answer that tied down the actual timing of this event. It said the month of July was relatively quiet. Well, I would hope so. It's probably 115 degrees. But it said, with the exception of the fact that the theft of some rawhide leather from Camp Pinnell and an urgent message about an attack on a supply train. So this was July of 1871. Now, in 1871, Mesa didn't exist.
No.
Superior didn't exist. Apache Junction was a gleam in somebody's eye. Phoenix was only a few years old. There wasn't any newspapers out here, and there wasn't any activity with cattle whatsoever until 1875, when the Silver King mine was found. Then a fellow named Matt Cavanis came out and got some land out here and started raising cattle to supply the miners at the Silver King mine. So there were no roads whatsoever in the wilderness area at that time.
Okay, well, that makes sense, and there was no road for you to miss to start with.
That's all right.
Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit. Here's another question for you from another one of the videos. The Apache Leap video was another one of those stories that drew an awful lot of attention about Indians and guns and everything else.
Well, I think the greatest amount of confusion about Apache Leap was because the archaeologists that done the study out there had made a determination that at the top of the cliff he had found where the cartridges of the Army, using Sharp's carbine cartridges, were found at the top of the ridge, but at the bottom of the cliff there were Spencer rifle cartridges. And his conclusion was that the Apaches had managed to get down off the cliff and were shooting back. And the question was, where did the Apaches get Spencer rifles? Well, that was answered by the fact that the governor of Arizona had ordered 500 Spencers in to be distributed to civilians for protection against the Apaches. So the Apaches obviously got these Spencers from raids that they had got on various farms and what have you, and whatever ammunition they had is how they went about getting it. I might add here that, you know, I like to watch a lot of Western movies. You probably have too, and I'll bet our viewers have all seen the movie They Died with Their Boots On, with Errol Flynn, you know, playing Custer. And that thing opened up in the Civil War period before it came out west, where Custer led the 5th and 6th Michigan Cavalry on numerous saber charges, with, you know, flags flying, sabers pointing out and everything, and nothing could be further from the truth, because the 5th Michigan was supplied 100% with Spencer carbines, 5-shot carbines, and 2 companies of the 6th Michigan were supplied with Spencer carbines. And this was the first time in the Civil War that the Union had ever fought the Confederates to a standstill. And the Spencer was the reason for it. And there's a picture here of the Spencer and how it's loaded. And then there's the carrying case for the refills. He's had 12 refill tubes already loaded, and that's quite a few shots
Oh, goodness,
for
yes.
anybody to go with.
So according to my calculations, if there are 12 of those reloading tubes and they each hold 7 rounds, you said 5.
Oh, I lied.
Okay, you lied. Okay, it holds 7. That's 84 rounds plus what was in the gun. These guys really could shoot a long time.
This led the Confederate cavalrymen to come up with that quote that they made, that those Yankees could load on Sunday and shoot all week.
And did. Well, now there was also some question that popped up in an earlier video, the one about the Dr. Thorne mine, where you talked about reloading cartridges. There was some real confusion that came down with questions from that.
Well, the confusion there came from the fact that I was telling a story about Cordon Cooley searching for the Lost Thorn mine, and Cordon was married to 2 Indian girls, the daughters of a chief, and he was friendly with the Apaches, and they were staying overnight near Sibique, and one of the Indians had showed them how he made a bullet to fit his gun. And as they inspected it, it turned out that he'd made that bullet out of pure silver. And the conversation went on to explain how they reloaded their rifles. And I didn't say what kind of rifle it was, but it was a centerfire rifle, because I was talking about how they they had the cartridges, but they didn't have any primers. So they took caps off of pistols, pistol caps, and crushed them up in the primer hole. And then they used a fine piece of sand as the anvil. And they put that, and then they put more caps crushed up in there. And that's what, the little anvil is what detonated the primer powder. And I got a picture here showing a centerfire cartridge. In the middle it shows it being empty, and on the right it shows it having a primer put in it, which was pressed in. And then on the left it shows the primer that's been detonated. Well, the real question came up because we were talking about Spencer rifles at Apache Leap, and this guy had come in and said there's no way you could reload a Spencer, but I wasn't talking about a Spencer. I was talking about a centerfire. And but the truth is, you can reload
the rimfires.
A rimfire. Here's a picture of 2 rimfires showing the primer, the firing pin indent on the edge of the rim. Now, all cartridges have a rim, because that's how the ejection mechanism pulls the shell out and ejects it for the next round to go in. Here's a picture next of a primer showing the cup and the anvil and the igniter compound. The firing pin on a centerfire actually strikes the anvil and drives the anvil into the volatile powder to detonate the cartridge. But the rim on a rimfire is hollow. As you see in the next picture, you see a centerfire on the left and you see a rimfire on the right. And the rim is hollow on the rimfire. And how they did that, matches were invented in 1825. And today, all of our matches are what they call safety matches. You take a match out, whether it's a little cardboard packet or a stick match, and you have to drag it across what looks like a piece of sandpaper to where it creates enough heat to detonate the match. But the original matches were strike anywhere matches, and they were extremely volatile. Sometimes when you struck one, some of it fell down and burnt a hole in your carpet. This was really high-powered stuff that they were using. So if you take a rimfire cartridge and you take the old match and you take all the powder off the end of the match and dump it in the case, and then you take a stick and just swirl it around in there, driving the match head up into the hollow part of the rimfire, you can reuse the rimfire. And it's actually easier to do that than it is to get a primer out and put another primer in.
Oh, but the only thing that you couldn't do with the rimfire was hit the same place on the...
That's right. When you loaded up the tube, you just rotated the firing pin mark to the bottom so that it can't be hit again.
It wouldn't hit again.
Yeah, and in theory, you could do that 3 or 4 times, I suppose.
I'll be darned.
But nobody said an Indian was stupid. They knew that, they figured this stuff out.
Well, they say that that the mother of invention is necessity, and the Indians didn't have anything, so they found a way to get.
Oh, you got
and
that
Lord
right.
knows there were plenty of cartridges. There just weren't bullets. There were just
And
lots
it was
of cartridges.
pretty easy to get a match to it.
I'm sure it was. Well, as near as I can see, some of the comments you said today kind of caught me by surprise. And you explained them well. They make sense to me now. I hope they answered the questions for a lot of other people too. Because those kind of questions come in all the time. Sometimes from experts who really don't know anything, and sometimes from people who don't know anything but know more than they thought they did, which is always kind of interesting. So you have anything else you'd like to say to close this puppy out?
Well, just that we don't plan on doing any more stories in parts.
Parts is parts. Yeah, I think that about wraps it up for today. But I do think we're going to have to do some more of these in the future.
Okay, I'm all for it.